Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to this latest narration, the web series Wearing Power Armor to a Magic School. If you're new to the series, there is a playlist listed down below in the description, and as always, I hope that you enjoy. Chapter 76, A Workout to Die For. Dragon's Heart Tower, Level 23, Residence 30, Living Room, Local Time, 19:20 hours. Emma. Civilization collapse is a scary thing to admit, but you can only be ruled by fear for so long before it starts taking over and stagnation takes root, I began, continuing off of the conversation that had started within the dorms, but that had somehow evolved and morphed into something else during dinner, before reaching something of a boiling point now that we had arrived back at the dorms following a rather uneventful evening out. I had planned on conducting an MRED experiment whilst everyone was away, but apparently another evening spent away from public eye would have brought a lot of unnecessary scrutiny my way, especially with the whole bird of salt saga still very much on everyone's mind. Your interchangeability swap of the terms stability and stagnation, Cadet Emma Booker, this makes me question whether or not this is a purposeful lexical choice on your behalf, or whether you lack the capacity to discern the nuances between the two. It's purposeful, Eleanor, I responded in no uncertain terms, but only after a quick comparative vocab analysis courtesy of the EVI. Because while I do see where you're coming from, and while I honestly and genuinely empathize with everything that comes with uncovering the truth of being the 10th in a long line of fallen civilizations, the fact of the matter is you can't allow your shortcomings to define who it is you are today. They should be learned, but they shouldn't be an outright reason to entrench yourself in permanence, Thelman offered. Yeah, permanence, and more so the propagation of the system that simply survives for its own sake. And for the sake of the cultural and historical legacy of those living within it, Eleanor quickly snapped, attempting to correct me mid-sentence. That may be the case. Then again, I did say that I see where you're coming from, but that doesn't stop you from trying to progress avenues of policy within the intent enshrining the well-being of everyone living within it, and enriching the lives of those people living today. A system such as your own, Cadet Emma Booker? I mean, that's what we've been attempting to do ever since we united, I acknowledged with a shrug. It is easy for you to make such bold claims with no fear of collapse when you yourself lack the capacity or access to the capabilities which might bring about such cataclysms. Oh, trust me, we've had some close calls of our own, I countered, keeping myself just on the edge of acceptable vagueness. Something Eleanor quickly called me on almost immediately. Are you saying that your mannerless kind possesses, or has access to, realm-destroying levels of power through even more than these mannerless artificers? This left me at an awkward impasse, prompting me to gesture towards my gun and the mothership drone that had since folded in on itself like a loafing cat behind us. You started off this week believing that a mannerless individual couldn't exist. I proved you wrong by simply walking through that portal. You then maintained the belief that a mannerless being couldn't possibly create constructs capable of matching or inflicting damage on a scale of a mage. I proved you wrong 2 times over now on that account. The first when I demonstrated the use of my gun, and the second in service of your side quest just a few days ago. You maintained the belief of a mannerless being couldn't possibly achieve flight. Do I need to go on? You need not go on, Cadet Emma Booker, Eleanor replied with a frustrated huff. However, I also need not remind you of a very important factor you simply not considering, and that is simply that you have yet to consider the role of the fates and the gods may play in your realm. If you mean gods in the typical sense, Eleanor, how do you imagine them to survive in a mannerless realm? Thalman interjected, more or less destroying Eleanor's argument in the process, as his maw hung agape all the while. I chose to move on following that little say from the Lupinar, giving the wolf a thankful nod before continuing. We don't need the interference of magical higher powers to force us into situations of potential societal collapse, Eleanor, I announced with a regretful sigh. We've pushed ourselves to the brink several times over, and yet we've managed to pull through each and every time. I guess in your mind you could attribute that to the lack of any magical deities that affected our minds, or the decisions of our leaders for whatever magical conspiracy you want to spout. But honestly, I'd attribute it to how I genuinely believe that our better judgment won out in the end of the day. Because, ultimately, we both are on the same page when it comes to this particular argument, Eleanor. I attempted to sway the talking points into the unexpected direction, taking the Venerian off guard. And pray tell, what could we possibly see eye to eye on, Earthrouter? We both value sanctity of civilization. We both want to see it continue, and for the legacies of the past to be enshrined. But while you guys have built yourselves a museum to the past and an altar to the present, you've inadvertently constructed a tomb for your future. We, on the other hand, have built a library in the bowels of a ship. Where that ship goes and what adventures await us, we don't know. But what we do know is that the more that library grows, the more we can improve the ship, so that we can carry on our legacy into whatever new sights and adventures we inevitably sail into. It didn't take you to be a poet, Cadet Emma Booker, Eleanor chided. Well, I guess I picked things up rather quickly, I shrugged in response. Perhaps you do have a point, Earthrealmer, Eleanor acknowledged, much to my surprise. Perhaps we do value the same thing, but that doesn't change the fact that your way is foolish and short-sighted. We've held our own and maintained our government for practically a millennium now, Eleanor. And the Eternal Realm has maintained itself and the stability of the adjacent realms 10, 20, 30-fold over that amount of time, Cadet Emma Booker. Eleanor spoke without skipping a single beat. Eleanor, Thalman finally interjected, a stoic look of confidence acting as a perfect counter to Eleanor's bombastic personality. Have you perhaps considered that it is exactly because of their mannerless state that they lack the same problems faced by the Nexus? Explain yourself, Lupanar. Simply put, perhaps it is exactly due to the chaotic and independent nature, free from the inexplicable shackles that comes with a manner-based society, that allows them to create something so novel that it defies traditional cycles of collapse. Perhaps it is, or perhaps it isn't, Dacia finally chimed in, much to the surprise of Eleanor, who was about to commit to a lungful of reports that would otherwise probably chew up most of the night in the yappings of a deluxe kobold. Perhaps now would be the best time to finally go about our own ways. Curfew is, after all, still in effect, and despite it being extended into midnight following the end of the grace period, it would still be prudent to make haste with our respective personal responsibilities. This abrupt and unexpected bit of mediation was a breath of fresh air, and once again proved to be successful as both Thalman and Eleanor nodded in unison. A wise and fair assessment, Dacia, the Lupanar acknowledged, disengaging from the conversation entirely, and heading for the front door with a series of heavy footsteps. I will see you either later tonight or in the morning for classes. Have fun at the gym, Thalman. I bid him a bit of a farewell with a wave, just as Eleanor, too, scampered off towards the door with a series of skittering footsteps. And where exactly are you going, Eleanor? I breathed out frustratingly. I have other friends too, Earthrealmer, he responded curtly. I want to go talk to people beyond just our social circle. Fair, I acknowledged, before diving into a tone of voice that was unabashedly stern. Just don't screw up like the last time you did with Malteroy, I stated in no uncertain terms, prompting the Venerian to stop mid-step. We are already on thin ice as it is with that fiasco, so just know that while I am amiable to helping, that there's a limit to how far I'm willing to go, Eleanor. I'm not saying this to be mean, nor am I asserting my dominance as a Nexian or whatever, but I feel I need to say this, just going off your track record so far. Noted, was all Eleanor said, as with the incredulous huff in what I assumed to be a begrudging display of acknowledgement, he left, once more slamming the door hard behind him. That just left me and Dacia together, prompting me to turn towards her with an appreciative smile. Thanks for the save there, Dacia. I know what you're about to say. I should have disengaged way before then, but, I don't know. Maybe it's because I needed to vent a bit after class, given how utterly insane all of these revelations have been. Maybe I just feel the need to come to grips with all of this and, with Eleanor's constant desires to reaffirm the whole Nexian narrative. I felt a need to go back and forth with him on it, I don't know. Maybe I'm just really out of it right now. Maybe you're just hungry, Emma, Dacia interjected in what was probably one of the least verbose and most candid moments in any of our interactions so far. What? Most sapiens that rely on physical sustenance as an aspect of their living form are often not themselves and find themselves becoming something else when they are hungry, she elaborated, more or less going back in the lack of verboseness. And judging by the number, or lack thereof, of these rations that you have been consuming throughout the day, I assume your cognitive and emotional capacity is perhaps hampered by a distressing lack of nutrition. I didn't expect Dacia's unofficial group mom title to carry through this far, especially with the concern being so palpable now that we were alone. "You know what, Dacia?" I began, once more reaching behind my head awkwardly. "You're right. I guess I am pretty hungry now that I think about it." I chuckled as the alien and unwelcome sensation of genuine hunger burned my insides. I'm trying my best to ration out these NutriPaste tubes as much as I can go right now, until I can confirm that the MRED is actually capable of demanifying foodstuffs that can actually service my nutritional needs. Dacia's features shifted from palpable worry to genuine concern at that statement, darkening to a point that conveyed everything I needed to know without even a word being uttered. "I see," she began, her tone matching that new degree of concern to a T. "And supposing it doesn't?" the avian managed out with a heavy breath. "What happens then?" "Well, you can only pack so much NutriPaste into containers, especially when there's so much more gear needed for me to survive," I replied nervously, beginning to walk towards our bedroom and towards the boxes in question. And despite my people having practically a millennium of experience in dealing with similar sorts of situations, the limitations imposed by the Academy on the amount and volume of cargo allowed did pose a unique sort of challenge to my situation. I quickly removed the cover of one of the crates, pointing to a perfectly hefty sum of efficiently sealed and packaged NutriPaste tubes, each of which were packaged in so tightly that it was difficult to separate one from the other without their distinct little hermetic seal caps. As a result, despite the generous amount of rations provided courtesy of my people, my supplies are still finite. The mission had always been to supplement and eventually wean myself off the rations and into local foodstuffs, provided, of course, that they were deemed sufficiently safe. But supposing it doesn't work out, either due to some nutritional deficiency or the existence of some fundamental biological, chemical, radiological, and physical hazards that might violate the Hazards Analysis and Risk Preventative Protocols, HARPP, well, in that case, I paused, shifting my tone to match that of Dacia's. I starve. A look of complete and utter shock took over the princess's expression, her rising crest feathers prompting me to quickly shift my direction on a dime at that little goof. "I'm just kidding, Dacia," I offered out with a mischievous grin, one that the Avanar princess clearly wasn't reciprocating, and for good reason at that. "In all seriousness, that's why they packed me this." I gestured towards another crate that was currently lodged halfway inside the decontamination chamber. Or rather, when it's done and fully assembled inside, it's supposed to resemble this. I gestured towards my forearm's embedded tablet, as a small little projection of an upright and see-through rectangular box held together with plastic fittings, rotated on its central axis, as if it was being presented in one of those forever open online stores by a forever online presenter during the height of the Corpo era. It's a specialty retrofitted and designed high-density aquaponics unit meant to maximize caloric output. Basically, it's designed to grow specifically engineered and bred forms of nutri-dense algae capable of being processed into more NutriPaste, I announced brightly. Though that brightness wasn't reciprocated by Dacia, as the holographic animation continued to show the contents of the see-through tower growing greener and greener, until finally the thick slurry of green sludge dominated the entirety of its confines. This was quickly followed up by a cutaway animation, as the uneven goopy green slurry was forcibly pushed through the inner workings, going through process after outreach process before emerging out the other side in one of the NutriPaste containers. It then finally completed its journey as the cartoonish suit of armor walked over to grab the grey pouch with an anachronistic smile plastered on its helmet. It was around the same time that a look of utter disgust formed in Dacia's face, that the reality of the situation also quickly dawned on me. The worst-case scenario had elevated me from starving, sure, but not by much. Because subsistence on super algae NutriPaste was going to suck even more than subsistence on the regular factory-made NutriPaste. That at least had decent artificial flavorings in them. "Algae," Dacia finally muttered out with a look of complete and utter disgust, ridden horror. I believe that's what is fed to some of the shellfish farms along the Flockstone coast, and in certain cases, luminous dyes and fish's ink." She attempted to come to terms with it by at least demonstrating her familiarity with the stuff, though the fact that she knew it only was animal feed and coloring probably wasn't doing my case any favors. Hey, if it'll help you sleep better at night, just know that this definitely isn't what my people eat on a regular basis, if at all nowadays," I managed out with yet another awkward chuckle. I will take your word for it, Emma, Dacia acknowledged through a forced smile. I am just happy to hear that you have an alternative means of sustenance, provided these MREDS experiments do not go as planned. Listen, Dacia, the solution is not ideal, at all. If I had more space, the team back in the IAS would probably whip up a full hydroponics suite with the proper range of crops and such. However, given the space constraints, we had to pull out a very, very undesirable piece of tech that we'd more or less moved beyond for a good few centuries now. Considering our logistics and food security measures, stuff like this isn't even a thing in the military anymore, let alone the civilian sector. However, given that I am a brave pioneer, I am more or less stuck with this as my only option. So I guess that's one of the many downsides that come with being an explorer. Though honestly, I'd say that it's still worth it, because otherwise I wouldn't have gotten to meet you of all people, Dacia. I beamed out the latter statement, prompting Dacia's expression to finally shift once more to that worried yet somewhat flustered look she sometimes had in these little talks. And, hey, even if it doesn't work out, the original factory-made nooch paste is going to last for a decent amount of time if I swap it in and cycle in between the algae paste, so it isn't too bad. I urged Dacia towards the container full of nooch paste tubes, pulling a few out to demonstrate my point. We got flavors like shredded barbecue, beef, braised lamb shanks, salmon pesto, meatball marinara, chicken Penang curry, chicken abodo, nasi lemak, fishbowl green curry, chicken pad krapao, takoyaki chicken, and 2 or 3 tofu or veggie options here. However, the thing that really kills it isn't the flavor itself. That aspect of it is fine. The thing that really kills it is the texture, because it's all the same squishy applesauce-like consistency that just irks the heck out of me. Dacia's eyes seemed to be fixated on one, then another tube as I lifted about 10 between my fingers for her to see. She opened her beak to respond, but what she said wasn't what I had all expected. These are all, meat-based foods? I paused, cocking my head in a confused before nodding. Well, yes, wait. Oh, did you assume that my kind exclusively ate pureed algae or something? Not necessarily, the Avanon replied with a polite nod. Your prior comments on your interests in the local Nexian dishes implies that you do have the capability to appreciate foods that are, more appetizing to both the eye and palate. Moreover, my curiosities were less to do with the inherent aspects of your dietary preferences, but more so the socio-economic implications of it. Go on, I urged, not quite expecting this turnaround. From what I saw of your people, the artificial farms within the sites here, I can understand that grains as well as produce could be produced in mass. But, and this is no offense to you, Emma, but as a commoner, in a mannerless realm no less, is meat really that plentiful as your roster of rations imply? The Avenal began, before quickly correcting herself just as those words left her beak. My apologies, Emma. I meant to refer to your citizenry rather than your commoners, a distinction that you made clear during your sightseer presentation. Oh yeah, I can definitely see where you're coming from, I acknowledged. I imagine that it isn't the case with most commoners within the adjacent realms and such. Not unless you're in a particularly manner-rich world that allows for Nexian methods of livestock rearing that increases yields, the princess offered, providing something of a fascinating insight into an aspect of the world I definitely wasn't anticipating touching upon today. To provide some context, in many adjacent realms, barring those richest in mana, most commoners make do with a diet only partially consisting of meats, and at times sparingly at that, primarily due to economic and ecological constraints. Your rations, however, seem to imply a meat-heavy diet, which posits the question, just how common are meat-heavy diets in your realm? Indeed, with your society consisting only of citizens, of equals, is it truly possible to maintain the diet of the wealthy merchant or a minor noble across the breadth of an entire population? Well, the long story short, Dacia, the answer to that question is yes, though historically that hasn't always been the case. It was only after the advent of a lot of tech that allowed for meat to be truly available in such quantities that it became a true staple across the board. Moreover, with the protocols for the minimum acceptable standards of living and a lot of other laws regarding this, it honestly just become an expected part of everyday living. The princess paused for a moment, as if going deep into thought at that. And by staple, do you mean to say that meat is as much as an afterthought as bread is to the typical commoner? Well, it's going to be complicated to compare our relative standards of living, but meat definitely isn't even an afterthought. It is sort of expected. Heck, you can have steaks every day if you wanted to. Not that I'd recommend it, of course. Like, it's part of a person's annually allotted requisition units, I offered, prompting an even more quizzical look to form on the princess's features than anything. Basically, it's universal right alongside a lot of other basic necessities, like guaranteed housing, public services, and amenities, and... I paused, realizing I was going down another rabbit hole that really shouldn't be gone down, at least not if we wanted to get anything done tonight. Anyway, yeah, maybe we can talk about this after the experiment? Oh, of course, Emma, Dacia responded curtly, her eyes portraying just how deep in thought she was at that point. Anyways, speaking of meat, honestly, I can't wait to see if I can get some meats inside that MRAD, but given the HARP protocols, meats and other animal food-based foodstuffs are going to need much more in the way of proper nutritional and food science-based studies to confirm whether or not they're edible, which means a lot more time before I finally get to take a bite out of whatever it is your equivalent of an A5 Wagyu is over here, I chuckled, before continuing on into a sigh. It's a whole thing the scientists back at home have mapped out, going from simple foods with minimal potential adverse interactions with our biologies to more complex foods that would increase the potential for an adverse reaction. I see, Dacia nodded thoughtfully. So in lieu of detection spells and other such means of magic-based tests, you have to, and I regret taking the word out of Illidor's vernacular, take a roundabout method to reaching the same ends? I guess you could put it that way, I shrugged. But it's a way that anyone can use, not just magic users. Requiring complex artifices and equipment, no doubt, Dacia argued, providing a rare bit of pushback that did make constructive sense. Similar to whatever machinations you need to facilitate these non-magical means of augmenting livestock yields. More or less, I nodded in acknowledgement, which again is exactly why my people are so on board with not seeing civilization collapse, because these tools, methods, equipment, and anything and everything in between more or less hinges on a healthy and alive civilization to continue what it is we're doing, I offered, more or less circling back to the start of the conversation, prompting Dacia to nod with a respectful look of acknowledgement. I appreciate the candidness and consistency of your reasoning, Emma, Dacia responded, before shifting her gaze back towards the food cart and the tent. With that being said, she paused once more, pointing at the flatbread dish, complete with an assortment of fruits and vegetables. I assume these would be acceptable to start with? Yes, I nodded. They very much will be. The Transgration Academy for the Magical Arts, Galnastray's Tower, the Grand Gymnasium, local time 2000 hours. Thalman. It was refreshing to finally be alone again after an entire week of what amounted to a back series of misadventures, culminating in a series of reality-altering experiences that rattled me to my very core. Indeed, there had been lulls in the action, breaks in the adventures, and in fact periods where the boisterous spirit of leisure finally did take hold. However, those moments were always had in the midst of those that I was quickly coming to call my allies, and as a result, those moments were very much still taxing on my mind that desperately needed peace, not leisure. It was at times like these that I very much appreciated the civilized Nexian reluctance to physical activity, as unlike the gymnasiums back home, which were almost always guaranteed to be occupied by at least a handful of occupants in the case of the castle's gymnasium, and an entire sub-district's worth of lupanars in the public gymnasiums, here in the Nexus, I could count a grand total of one, that being me. In fact, the more I went about my business within the gymnasium facilities, the less I saw any evidence of any of the equipment or amenities having been used. Now, perhaps that was simply due to the efficiency of the cleaning staff, but more likely, I knew the place was more or less abandoned by the entirety of the student body, which was honestly nothing short of heathen in my eyes. As I began strutting about the smooth tile floors with a confident swagger, entering into my own sort of trance as I went about the same routines I usually did back home. Except this time with an even greater sense of power behind me, courtesy of the rich and dense mana streams that felt practically limitless compared to what it was back home. The marble tile floors were a strange but understandable choice, as the space was after all dominated by a large swimming pool that took up much of the available area. Around it and nearest to the front entrance were more devices that I was familiar with, such as complex artifices designed to allow the user to lift, pull, push, and float. These are all made possible by the anachronisms of oars and barbells that were adorned with a variety of embellishments, so that to hide the fact that they resembled tools and activities the peasantry might perform, and something that a highborn would otherwise shy away from, like snow worm to hot sand. So after inspecting each and every piece of equipment with great fascination, admiring the craftsmanship, ignoring the fact that Nexian hands had crafted these tools, I soon summoned for a change of clothes with a small burst of magic, replacing the armor and ornate fineries I had on with something more practical for the occasion, which soon enough was put to good use as my eyes honed in on the largest tool of physical training in the room and immediately leapt into it with a resounding splash. The feeling of that refreshing cool water, which other species might seem downright hellish, was nothing short of a paradise for the senses on my hot and aching body. A body that now channeled every ounce of that frustration, that tiredness, that pent-up energy into the act that I always relished, swimming. The rush of energy that coursed through my whole body was enhanced by the use of ambient matter around me as I pushed harder than I ever could back at home. This was one of the few rare boons of being here in the Nexus, and this was what was pumping all sorts of good feelings into my head, as with each harsh exertion came the reward of physical accomplishment. It might have been alien to the Nexian sensibilities, but it felt good for the Lupinar inside of me. This continued until I had lost track of time and began taking the occasional dive back and forth between the surface and the bottom of the pool, as I savored in the silence and serenity of the prolonged dives. It was strangely therapeutic, almost akin to meditation, with the world around me dulled by the depths of the calm and unmoving water. Indeed, I would have continued testing the limits of my breath, if not for the mana fields detecting the presence of someone else entering the room, making their way towards the lip of the pool. This fact alone was enough to cause me to resurface. But the ensuing surge, crackle, and ripple of mana that followed suit prompted me to outright hasten that journey. I immediately swam up, and with a purposeful mana-added kick to my legs, was poised to leap right out through the calm surface of the water, only to feel my head slamming against a barrier that should not be there. I recoiled in pain, almost exhaling the contents of my lungs in a fit of pained grunts. Confusion took hold as I stared up, expecting to see a barrier, instead being met with a clear and calm waters. This prompted me to immediately reach out towards the lip where the water met the floor, but instead of the desperate limb emerging through the clear surface, it met a smooth, uncompromising, and seamless invisible barrier. Moreover, I could see the water sloshing against this invisible glass-like enclosure. My eyes grew wide as I took a hard slam against the barrier with both my fists, only for the glass to respond with an uncompromising thunk. My heart began racing as my world slowed to a crawl. My legs began treading the water with increasing frenzy until finally their momentary panic shifted into steeled resolve. My training crept up, supplanting the panic and confusion with only one singular task in mind: getting out. End of chapter. I'd quickly like to thank the T5 peeps: Cold War Boomerwaffen, Sevaren Serberous, Bushmaster 177, Henry the Red, Casper Arnholtz, Cold War Boomerwaffen, Elijah Silvercross, Dragzoon W.R.E, and Sevaren Serberous. Thank you very much.